Yeah, great to be with you today. So first of all, you look and sound great. 93 looks good on you, in my opinion. And I'm humbled and honored that you have taken this time to be with us today. So I want to eventually get to wrestling with some basic fundamental philosophical questions today, but I thought it would be apropos to first deal with the news of the day. Roe v. Wade, the 1973 Supreme Court general abortion rights protection decision, has been overturned. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's my own thoughts are that Roe v. Wade made a legitimate, reasonable compromise between two moral positions which are opposed, one having to do with rights of women, the other having to do with rights of the unborn. There's a understandable disagreement about the nature and relative force of these rights. A sane solution would be a reasonable accommodation between them. And I think that was pretty much hit by Roe v. Wade. The attack on abortion rights will drive us back to an earlier situation in which abortions will, of course, continue, but they will be illegal and harmful, available to the privileged, mostly undertaken by the poor and underprivileged, with many disasters, both for the women and the children. We had that situation before. I'm old enough to remember it, and there's every reason to expect that will happen. If the Republican support for abortion rights, which is what is driving this, is for the most part pure cynicism. We can see that by looking at the history. So go back to the 1960s. The leading figures in the Republican Party, like Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, were what we now call pro-choice. In fact, as governor of California, Reagan signed one of the strongest pro-choice legislations of the day. In the mid-1970s, a Republican strategist, Paul Weyrich, recognized that if the Republicans pretended to be opposed to abortion, they could pick up the huge evangelical vote, which previously had been mostly unpoliticized, and the Northern Catholic vote. So they switched on a dime. They all suddenly became strongly anti-abortion. And it continued from there. Take Donald Trump. I can't imagine he cares one way or another about abortion, but he's a good enough politician to know that the pretense will pick up votes in his basic constituency, which is evangelical, rural, white, Christian, and so on. That leaves open the question of what is the proper legislation. And again, in my view, I think that Roe v. Wade was a reasonable compromise between conflicting moral stands, each of which is quite understandable.
I'm personally worried about a potential increase in dangerous abortion methods that some women are going to have to resort to. We would hope that they would, go somewhere where they're legally allowed to get an abortion, but not every woman's going to have the means to do that. So I see this as a crisis.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that.
I was just saying that I'm worried about the increase in dangerous abortion methods that, I think might be inevitable because of the lack of options that women are going to have now in certain parts of the United States.
Well, I think we should pay attention to the actual decisions. They're very revealing. Both Alito's decision and Clarence Thomas's concurrent opinion. Alito's decision was based on the principle, which he states explicitly, that we have to take historical tradition into account in interpreting what's in the Constitution and the amendments. And he points out correctly that in the tradition, there's basically nothing said about rights of women. Well, his conclusion is we don't have to care about rights of women. Another conclusion is, yes, the tradition was awful. In fact, if you look at the tradition, at the time of the Constitution, women were not considered persons. They were considered property. A woman is the property of her husband. The property is of her father. The property is handed over to the husband. That's the tradition. When you get to a later period, practice kind of attenuates. But in the law, women weren't determined to be full persons until 1975, when the Supreme Court did rule that they are peers who can have a right to serve in federal juries. Well, that's a comment on the tradition. If we want to say, let's live up to the tradition, it's an ugly, horrible tradition. In a sane society, we wouldn't be taking the ugly tradition to be the basis for how to determine rights. Take Thomas's concurrent opinion. He said that he agreed with Alito that this decision didn't explicitly refer to other cases, but he mentioned the other cases that he thought should now be reviewed on the same grounds. Mentioned three. The first one was the right to contraceptives. The Supreme Court did give people the right to contraceptives. Thomas said there's no basis for that in the tradition or in the law, so therefore we should review that and rescind it. The second was the right to a choice of sexual partner. Again, he said it's not in the tradition. In fact, the U.S. had anti-sodomy laws up to the 2000s. So yes, there's a horrifying tradition, and he says we have to live up to it. Third case was same-sex marriage. Again, he says, quite rightly, it's not in the tradition. Framers wouldn't have been in favor of it. So therefore, let's get rid of it. Justice Kennedy, in the case of choice of sexual partners, the Lawrence case, gave the majority opinion, which was that the government should not step in to people's perfectly private business. It's their business, not the state's. Thomas disagrees. And in this case, his history is correct. It was until very recently, was taken for granted in our ugly tradition that the state has the right to interfere in people's private decisions about their personal relations with others. Well, behind this lies a deeper question about what's called originalism. the reigning doctrine today.
Hmm.
It's very recent, incidentally. It was first suggested by Bork, who gave no real support for it, later developed by Scalia, a couple of others. It's now the reigning doctrine. Now, there are two versions of it. One version, the extreme version, the one that reigns today, is that we must keep to either to the actual text or at most to the tradition that it means in effect that we should be governed by the decisions and attitudes actually of a small group of white male slave owners, wealthy white male slave owners who met 250 years ago. That should be what determines the way our lives should be organized in society, with modifications for amendments. There's a weaker form of originalism, which says, but we should also take into account how they would act under current circumstances. That position, the weaker one, was ridiculed rightly by Justice Jackson 70 years ago, when he pointed out that it's about like trying to read the dreams of Pharaoh and ask how they were interpreted. He went on to point out you can find any position about how to read the dreams. Well, he ridiculed the saner version. What's now prevailing is the extreme version, very recently. And it's very interesting to watch how it works. So, for example, Thomas and Alito say we must take into account the historical tradition. Well, there's another, the most famous and revered modern originalist is Antonin Scalia, who ruled in the Heller case, 2008. He reversed a century of precedent and said that we must have an individual right to bear arms. And notice the day before the Roe case, the Supreme Court overturned, Thomas this time, overturned a century-old law that said that if you want to carry concealed weapons for self-defense, you have to provide a justification. Thomas argued, no, you don't need any justification. It infringes on a fundamental right, namely the right of everyone to carry arms for self-defense, concealed weapons for self-defense. What Thomas is ruling is based on the assumption that the United States is a totally insane society, a danger to itself and everyone else. There's no other society in the world, except a developed society, where people have to defend themselves when they go for a walk with their dog, or when they go to pick up their kids at a nursery school. If a society is so insane that you need arms to defend yourself in such circumstances, the society is in deep trouble. Let's go to Scalia's argument, which set this off. You take a look at the Second Amendment. It says, in order to maintain a well-organized militia, people should have the right to bear arms. Well, what did the framers have in mind when they set that up? We know very well, and we know what the history and tradition is. And what it does is, I'll go through it if you want, but it demonstrates that the Second Amendment was a complete anachronism by the 20th century. You didn't need arms to kill Indians. You didn't need arms, a militia to control slaves. You didn't have to defend yourself in case the British were coming. which was a real issue in 1783, the 1780s, because the US had basically no army. So it's all an anachronism. But in order to show that, you would have had to look at the history. And Scalia's position was the history is irrelevant. So it turns out the history is irrelevant when it leads to turning a perverted version of the Second Amendment into Holy Writ. But the history is relevant when you want to ban contraceptives and people's privacy and their lives and the right to abortion. Well, that's a modern version of originalism, which raises quite interesting questions about what kind of society we're living in. And notice that this Roberts Court has taken to itself enormous powers. It's demanded rights to control the nature of society, which don't have any constitutional basis. They have a version of judicial supremacy that goes well beyond anything that you can find a basis for in the Constitution. But it does have the advantage that you can twist and turn so it comes out with the most reactionary conclusions. Well, that's the reality we're facing. The overturning of Roe is just one example of it.
Right. Well, as a Canadian,
comment about that. The Thomas decision on the right to bear arms has a much broader significance. There's been a long-standing effort. There's a case coming up which will determine it, but there's been a long-standing effort on the part of the right-wing corporate sector to eliminate what's called the administrative state. That is to make sure that the government cannot institute regulations, which means carte blanche for private power to do anything it wants. Well, that's part of the background for the case of the reversing the New York decision. And it's coming up very soon in West Virginia versus EPA. Will the EPA have the right to regulate CO2 emissions, for example? The right wing wants to abolish that by saying that the government cannot institute any regulation unless it has been explicitly legislated by Congress, which means no regulations, because the way we have lived so far is that Congress authorizes certain actions like reduce pollution. Then it's handed over to expert bodies like the EPA or others to study the situation, determine how it can be done, have serious discussion about it, have public inputs, finally make a decision. Congress can't possibly do that. They can't look into every contingency that'll come up in application of a regulation. So this is a roundabout way of saying no regulations. In other words, private power does anything it wants with no concern for the consequences. And in this West Virginia case that's coming up, the consequences are rather significant. The survival of organized human life on Earth. That's not an exaggeration. If the government cannot make regulations controlling poisoning of the atmosphere, we can say goodbye to each other. There'll be profits for the fossil fuel companies for a couple of years, and then we'll all be gone, because organized human life won't survive. That's what's at stake in what you're seeing in Washington right now. You're looking at particular instances of it but they're part of the same campaign.
Well, thank you for that answer. I hope you can hear me a little better now. I've turned up my mic. The next thing I wanted to ask you about, Noam, is the phenomena of inner speech or lack thereof. Vygotsky has a theory suggesting that the conversations we have with ourselves have the properties of dialogue because it comes from social exchanges. Noam, you introduced the notion of phase, a partial structure that is committed to intermediate memory via inner speech. So I guess I wanted to ask you first, do you experience inner speech? Because I don't.
Well, Vygotsky made an important step forward by saying we should at least pay attention to this. But the fact is, what's called inner speech is outer speech. When you say something to yourself, you can determine whether it rhymes with something else. You can determine how long it is. That's not inner speech. That's external speech in which you haven't activated the articulatory organs. So it's getting nowhere near inner speech. We do have inner speech, but we have to study it from the outside, the way you study the operation of the huge nervous system that controls how the autonomous systems of the body operate. We can't introspect into them. The only thing you know about them is if you have a stomach ache, they're not working. But you can't introspect into how they're working. That's a huge nervous system, very much like the one that's up here. We can't introspect into this one either. We can only see some external parts of it, fragments that come to mind. And if you think seriously about those fragments, you can tell that they're nowhere near what's going on inside. So take any ordinary experience, simple experience. You walk into a restaurant, you see your friend Joe is sitting there. You remember you wanted to talk to him about something, but then you notice that he's talking to Mary, and Mary won't like to hear what you're going to say. So you better not say it. So you think, well, I'll say something else when I go over. All of this happens in a microsecond, a fraction of a microsecond. It's impossible for speech to go that fast, no matter how fast. The nervous system just doesn't work like that. Right. And this is a small example. There are much more complex ones. So in fact, if you think about what's called inner speech, it's little bits of fragments of complicated stuff that's going on in your mind. And when you concentrate on the fragments, you can expand them into a full sentence the way I just did. But you don't do that when you're experiencing it. So inner speech is a superficial series of fragments that have something to do with what's going on in your mind. But what's going on in your mind is real inner speech. And that we can study, but we study it the way we study the enteric nervous system, the nervous system that controls the functioning of the body from the outside. And we can learn a lot about it that way, but it's not inner speech.
So when I speak with people about this, they describe being able to, like, for instance, if they're reading a book, they're hearing the narration in their head as they're reading, like silently to themselves. I have never experienced that. I've never heard words narrated in my mind at all. And I've tried to, meditate and focus on this and try to pick something up. But it's more like if I read this juice container to myself, I am kind of recording the data of, 100% juice. Okay, I read that in my mind. I don't hear any dialogue or words or any kind of narration. I just kind of record the data.
You can't you have no way to introspect into the workings of your mind. Like, give you a simple example. Take what are called anaphors, words that don't refer to anything, but have to pick up their reference from something else. So words like each other, for example. The boys like each other. The interpretation of each other depends on the nearest possible antecedent, the boys. So it's the boys like each other. Suppose I say the boys expect the girls to like each other, and it's the girls who like each other. I'm still picking the closest antecedent. Suppose I say, which girls do the boys expect to like each other? Well, the closest antecedent is the boys, but that's not the one you're using. You're using the girls. Well, there's a reason for that, and we understand it. The reason is that what's going on in your mind is you're forming the expression, which girls do the boys expect the girls to like each other? You don't hear that, and you don't, it's not in what we call inner speech, but that's what's going on in your mind. And then the anaphor is picking the closest thing. So why don't we say it? Well, we don't say it because of a major computational principle, which is sort of a least effort principle, which is in carrying out an action, do the least work possible. Well, the least work, that's a very general principle. It's a principle of performance generally. And in this case, the way to do the least work possible is not to pronounce the girls. Our minds tell us it's there. So, and that's the same is true for the listener. The listener's mind will reconstruct it because of the way,
no worries.
Because of the way that, see if I can kill this. Okay. That's just the way the mind operates for good reasons. Turns out that it keeps to economy principles. And therefore you don't carry out the articulatory motions or even the internal motions, the internal computation that would guide them, because they're all reconstructible instantly by the way the mind functions. Well, that's a very simple example, but that generalizes. We have no idea from introspection about what's going on in our minds. We can find it out by the kind of study that we use to study everything else in the world, by looking at empirical phenomena, trying to construct the best explanatory theory for them. You have to study the mind the same way. And when you do, you find quite interesting things, but you can't introspect into it.
Interesting. Okay, I think that kind of makes me want to move to metaphysics for a second. Do you ever think we will be ever to physically measure concepts? Instead of looking at the brain for tumors, we will look for pink elephants?
Sorry, but I didn't catch that.
I'm wondering if you believe that we'll ever be able to physically measure concepts. Instead of, measuring brain functionality the way that we do now, we will be able to somehow measure concepts in and of themselves, metaphysics becoming physical objects.
The brain sciences are nowhere near that point. The brain sciences are difficult enough for all organisms, but for humans, the brain sciences are inordinately difficult for a very simple reason, ethical reasons. We cannot do invasive experiments with humans. That means not just brain experiments, but even controlled experiments. You can't raise humans from infancy in isolation to see what would happen, let's say. You can't raise infants with constructed environments to see how they would react. There's a million experiments you can think of that could give you a lot of insight into how the human mind works, but they're just bored. Well, same is true for human vision. You can't investigate human vision by sticking electrodes into the striate cortex, but we do it, rightly or wrongly, with other animals. Rightly or wrongly, we do invasive experiments with cats and monkeys. They happen to have about the same visual system. So there's been many years of research with invasive experiments in the visual systems of other organisms, and a lot has been learned about the human visual system, which is about the same. You can't do that with language. There are no other organisms. It's a unique human capacity, which has no analog anywhere else. So you're kind of stuck. Can't do the experiments for ethical reasons. There's no comparative evidence because there's no comparable animal, no other animals have the capacity. So it's a very difficult study. Nevertheless, there are some results by quite sophisticated measures to get around these obstacles. But the result is you can't answer very serious questions about how the neural basis for language. In fact, that's even true of many other things. Take, say, I happen to live in the desert. Out in the backyard, there's desert ants, which have astonishing capacities of computation way beyond humans. They can navigate in ways that humans can't begin to duplicate without complicated instruments. Well, with a desert ant, we allow ourselves to do any experiment you can think of. But with all that, nobody really understands the neural basis for insect navigation. It's quite intricate and pretty remarkable. But these are hard problems.
Yeah.
And when you start asking about, and remember here you have a brain that's almost invisible, a tiny brain, but nevertheless you can't do it. Science is hard.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I wanted to jot your memory a little bit and bring you back to a memory of your mother. You and your mother wrote a play together in Hebrew, yes?
Say that again. I didn't hear the last sentence.
You and your mother wrote a play together in Hebrew when you were a young man.
Did we play together?
You wrote a play together?
Did we write a play together?
Yeah.
We did, yeah. But that's not that far back.
Oh, okay.
It's the 1940s. That's not that far.
Oh, yeah. So do you remember the premise of that play? I've written a few plays myself. I was wondering if you can remember.
No recollection.
No recollection?
It was in Hebrew.
Right.
Not in English. And it was for some school, Hebrew school affair. I don't remember what.
Okay. Yeah. I heard you say that in a conversation you had, and that sparked my interest. So a question on ethics. How does Noam Chomsky discern right from wrong?
How do I discern right from wrong?
Mm-hmm.
Same way you do. Look at the evidence, look at the arguments, see if they're sound, try to draw conclusions. It's been known since the 17th century that we can never reach certainty in empirical matters. Maybe you can with arithmetic, even that's open to question, but you certainly can't do it in empirical matters. You just have to try to construct the best explanations you can and draw conclusions from what evidence and arguments are available. There's no algorithm, there's no method. A lot of it is creative activity, which is not understood.
Right. The religious would claim that they have the objective moral rule on their side. What do you have to say to the religious objectivists, moral objectivists that believe they have, the objective moral rule, regardless of what you could demonstrate empirically?
You're speaking of moral objectivism.
Yeah.
There is a true right or wrong, independently of what we might think. What do we do with that notion? If it's independently of our efforts to understand, we're obviously not going to be able to say anything about it by definition. So why bring it up?
Yeah. I think that's, they would point to their holy books as holding the objective moral truth. And yeah, I see that as just more moral subjectivism. I was curious, what you consider within your moral calculus when you are determining, okay, well, we could jump to epistemology into how you determine what is true. What is your criteria for truth? Do you rely on correspondence, coherency, pragmatism, realism?
Before asking, it's ordinary scientific common sense that before raising highly complex questions, you ask, can I solve the problem for much simpler cases? So let's take a look at simpler cases. How do I decide whether the laws of motion are true? Well, you do the best you can. You take a look at the evidence you can accumulate. You do clever experiments. If it's Galileo, you do thought experiments. We can do actual experiments now. And you draw some conclusions about, here's the best theory I can come up with about the laws of motion. Can't do any better than that. Now, suppose someone says, well, what about the real laws of motion? I don't know what that's supposed to mean. This is as far as we can go in discovering the laws of motion. It's like asking, when I look at you, when I look at the computer screen, I see an image which I interpret as being a person. How do I know that there actually is a computer screen? And maybe some have argued, I'm a character in a simulated world being controlled by somebody who's running the simulation. Nick Bostrom is one of the philosophers who's proposed that, even argued that it's true. How do I find out? If there's a question that there's no way to answer, why bother with it? Plenty of interesting questions that we can, in principle, answer. So let's deal with those.
There's a common quote that is often shared in the free speech circles by you, Noam, and the quote is, if we do not believe in freedom of speech for those we despise, we do not believe in it at all. Do you still feel that way?
Yes, I think that should be obvious. Take Stalin or Hitler. They were perfectly in favor of freedom of speech for views they approved of. Do we regard them as exponents of freedom of speech? The question of freedom of speech only arises when, with regard to views that you don't like. That goes back, insight goes back as far as you can trace it. Voltaire, for example. But it's a truism. Any child understands it. If you don't believe in the right of somebody who disagrees with you to speak. You don't believe in freedom of speech?
I wanted to next ask you an aesthetics question. What do you find to be most beautiful?
To be
Most beautiful.
most beautiful? It's not a question that I can answer. Too many things in many different dimensions. Life is full of many kinds of beauty, whether it's a Beethoven quartet or the face of your great-grandchild, all kinds of things. Can't measure them.
I like that answer. I wanted to ask you one more question, then I'm going to bring in a couple callers who will have a couple questions. On death, do you fear death, Noam?
Sorry, missed it again.
Do you fear death?
I didn't catch it.
Oh, do you fear death?
Do I fear death?
Yeah.
Oh. Well, when I was about 12 years old, there was a very brief period in which I was terrified by the idea that if my consciousness disappeared, everything would disappear. And that was frightening. And for all I know, it's true. But by the time I was a couple of months older, I reconciled myself to that and haven't worried about it since.
That's a good attitude. I like that. I'm going to bring in one of my show hosts, Don Don, now. Don Don, you are live with Noam Chomsky. And everyone who asks a question, just try to be as loud and clear as you can for Noam.
Hi, Noam. How you doing? Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah, hi.
Hi. So I have a few questions for you, and I think they'll be intriguing. My first question is, I know that when you were 10 years old, your first article was, you wrote an article in 1939 about the spread of fascism following the fall of Barcelona during the Spanish Civil War. And I was wondering, what parallels do you see about the spread of fascism today in the United States?
Fascism today in the United States?
Yeah.
Well, actually, for somebody my age, there's a lot of irony. Back in 1939, what I found, and what the article was about, is what I found very frightening was the spread of fascism in Europe. First, Germany, Italy, Austria, Czechoslovakia, then Franco Spain, which was what the article was about. It seemed inexorable. It looked as if fascism was simply going to spread over Europe, maybe the world. Well, at that time in the United States, there was a breakthrough to developing social democracy. It's called the New Deal. So if you look back at the history of those, and of course, as a 10-year-old, I didn't have great understanding of any of this, but it was obvious enough that Europe and the United States were going in opposite directions. Europe was going into the hideous depths of fascism. In the United States, there was a terrible depression, but there was hope. The United States was moving forward to a much more civilized society, New Deal style social democracy. Now it's almost the reverse. The United States is descending into a kind of proto-fascism. Europe is still maintaining some level of social democracy. You can see this all over the place. I mean, take something as elementary as your health. So a couple of days ago, a study came out in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, the most respected scientific journal, trying to estimate the number of deaths from COVID that are attributable to our incompetent privatized health system. They estimated at about over 200,000 deaths just from failure to institute the kind of universal health care available to the public generally that you have in almost every other society, including underdeveloped societies. Well, that's a sign of major social breakdown. So in the United States, we have a privatized healthcare system, has about twice the costs of comparable countries, some of the worst outcomes. One outcome we just learned about a couple of days ago is several 100,000 extra deaths. And of course, and that we find that all over. It takes something as elementary as maternal health care. Everywhere. The United States doesn't have it. There's no guaranteed maternal health care. My wife happens to be Brazilian. In Brazil, there's 2 months guaranteed maternal health care, 4 months if you ask for it. Every country in the world, except the United States, has this. The United States and a couple of Pacific islands. And this runs across the board. We have serious social maladies in the United States. Take what Travis and I were talking about before. Justice Thomas's decision a couple of days ago, reversing a century-old precedent on concealed weapons. What he decided is, he didn't put it this way, but this is the import of what he decided. He decided that the United States is afflicted with a kind of clinical insanity. It's the kind of country where you'd have to carry a concealed weapon for self-defense when you walk around in the streets. There's no other country like that. I mean, it's kind of criminal insanity. Well, take a look at what happened after the Uvalde massacre of the couple dozen children. There was a poll taken about a week later. Turned out among Republicans, 40% said massacres like this we have to tolerate in the name of freedom, namely my freedom to walk around with an assault rifle. Something really sick about the society. Those are real problems. And then there's the real protofascism, the effort to undermine democratic elections. We see that very dramatically. Among Republicans, 70% believe that Trump won the election. Just a couple of days ago, the Republican Party in Texas officially declared in its program that Biden is not the legitimate president. Trump is. That's basically secession. Things like this are being implemented in legislation in Republican-run states. There's a couple hundred bills moving which are intended to restrict voting in such ways as to prevent the voting of people who are going to vote the wrong way. Well, those are moves towards proto-fascism, and they may succeed. There are efforts to ban books, ban them, to say you can't teach them in schools, you can't have them in libraries. Why? Well, because, take a look at the laws, because you can't teach anything in school that is divisive or that makes certain students feel uncomfortable, meaning white students. That means you can't teach history. Every country in the world, history is divisive and makes people uncomfortable because it's not pretty. So this is a law saying, Trump actually proposed it as a federal law. I didn't have time to institute it, but it's going on state levels. You can't teach history. Well, we're getting pretty close to fascism.
Mm-hmm.
There are scholars, Timothy Snyder, others, who describe it as fascism. I prefer the phrase proto-fascism.
Proto-fascism.
Some early symptoms of fascism. Well, you go back 90 years. In the 1930s, it was the opposite. It was Europe that was drifting towards fascism. The United States was leading the way to a social democratic society that paid some attention to human rights. Now we've reversed it.
When you think back to the early 2000s, when the internet really became a part of private life, did you expect it and to result in such a shift towards proto-fascism by manufacturing consent, or did you expect the internet to actually liberate people from the shackles of these corporations?
If we move to fascism, we will destroy the climate quickly. Who's going to run it? The people who will run the fascist state are those who want to design policy in their interest. Well, what their interest is was described quite accurately 250 years ago by Adam Smith. He pointed out that those who have the power to control and design policy will follow what he called the vile maxim, namely, all for ourselves, nothing for other people. That's the way, as he put it, in all ages, those with power act. Democratic system can restrict and control that. So if you want to destroy the world quickly, let's move to fascism. And if you want to protect the world from destruction, let's develop a functioning democratic system in which the general population will act to defend themselves, their children, and their grandchildren by taking the actions that are feasible to overcome the climate crisis. In fact, we're seeing a struggle about this right now. It's going to be a struggle in Washington. There's going to be, as I said, a critical decision in the Supreme Court in a couple of days. Keep your eyes open for it. West Virginia versus the EPA. Question is, coming to the court is, does the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, have the right to pass regulations to limit pollution in power plants? Can it limit the CO2 emissions? If the court decides against it, we're well on our way to a society that is dedicated to destruction of the human species in the near future. And that's not an exaggeration. The only way to stop it is to prevent those who have power, private economic power, from pursuing their vile maxim. All for ourselves, nothing for anyone else. If the society can't prevent that in the only way possible, by government regulations, we're finished.
What advice would you give young people to try to fight against this corporate class?
Sorry?
What advice would you give young people today as a way to actually try and challenge these corporate classes?
Sorry, I still couldn't hear it.
Don was saying, what advice would you give to young people if they wish?
Advice?
Yeah, to young people.
It's just kind of interesting question, because it's the young people who are giving the advice to the rest of us. The people who are in the forefront of trying to avert the crisis are young people. Take a look at the last meeting of the international meeting in Glasgow of the International Organization to try to deal with climate change last October. Actually, two events took place. One event was inside the stately halls where the rich and powerful were meeting. Another event was going on in the streets, and they were quite different. In the streets, there were young people, thousands, demanding that you do something. On the inside, the gentlemen and ladies were figuring out ways not to do anything. So who's supposed to give the advice here? The advice was given by Greta Thunberg eloquently when she spoke at the Davos meeting of the rich and powerful, gave a brief, good talk on global warming, and then said, "You have betrayed us." She was talking to my generation, to the next generation, said, "You've all betrayed us." Well, they're giving the advice, and we should follow it. Young people are in the lead. They can do things, have succeeded in doing many things. Important to recognize that severe as the climate crisis is, there are feasible ways of dealing with it, perfectly feasible ways. They've been laid out in detail. They would require maybe 2 to 3% of gross domestic product to convert us to renewable energy in a reasonable amount of time, a couple of decades, and avert other aspects of environmental destruction that are going. It's not just global warming, it's also destroying the oceans by filling them with plastic, many destroying habitat, industrial agricultural processes which are destroying the land. And none of this is a law of nature, can all be changed, all within reach, but it's going to take a lot of will to do it. And the advice to young people is do it and see if you can get the older generation to join you. This is a lot at stake. What's at stake is the survival of organized human life on Earth in the near future.
Don.
Thank you so much, Noam.
Okay.
Thank you, Pangburn. I appreciate it, guys.
Yeah, thanks, man. I really appreciate it. I'm going to bring in Dal Tsu next. Add Dal Tsu to stream. Dal, please unmute yourself, and you're up with Noam.
Awesome. Hey, Noam. It's great to meet you. I've been really excited for this for a long time. I think I have a couple of questions, but the one that especially coming off of Don's questions, the one I want to get off the most is, do you think that it's possible to decouple the economy from politics? And do you think that would help our political situation at all?
Is it possible to have an economy and a political system that's where I lost the words.
Do you think it's possible to separate the money from our political system, so that like the person getting the most donations won't win necessarily, because that seems
Not catching it. Can you write it in the chat?
Yeah, maybe write in the chat there, Dal, and we'll then Noam can have a read. Everyone who's listening, we are going to be having a conversation on call-in. I gave you guys the link. It's in the pinned tweet on YouTube. After we let Noam go, we're going to meet up on call-in to have a conversation about this podcast. While Dal works on his question here, and just try to simplify it as much as you can, Dal.
Separate money from politics? Absolutely. It's not totally. I mean, to the extent that you have concentrated economic power, whatever laws you have, it's going to have an influence on the political system. So as long as you have radical inequality, the way we have, there's going to be effects of economic power on the political system, but you can reduce it. We have an unusual system of funding elections. First of all, we have a long electoral process. Goes on, in fact, we're already talking about 2024. That's a long time to be working on elections. Furthermore, the reactionary Supreme Court, the current Supreme Court, has basically opened the doors for political contributions to take over elections. That's what was done with Citizens United. And it's based on an earlier court decision back in the 70s, which declared that money is speech. So if you have free speech, you have to allow free use of money in elections. No justification for any of that. Money's not speech. Speech can be, take the elections again in Brazil, my wife's country my wife's from. There, as in many countries, political parties are given public money and public time on television. Well, that has an equalizing effect. Doesn't get you down to perfect equality, but it has a mitigating effect on concentration of wealth. So there are many ways to get it out of politics. The deeper one is to eliminate the inequality. That's the fundamental problem, and that's not impossible either. The United States inequality is out of sight. That's in the last 40 years, after Ronald Reagan basically opened the spigots and said, do what you like, no constraints. But that can certainly be controlled. In fact, it even was controlled in earlier stages of American history, but it can be eliminated. And then beyond that, there are many technical means of reducing the effect of concentrated wealth on the political system, like the few that I mentioned. So I think it can be
Okay, Dal put his next question in the chat.
Which one do you want to turn to?
The one so here, I'll read it out loud. And to what extent does language influence our ability to create novel ideas? Could we break these limits?
Well, that's a rather deep question. It's related, it has to do with the question of what is the relation between language and thought altogether. Well, there's a tradition that goes back 2,500 years, classical Greece, classical India, which holds that language and thought are identical. Language is the system that generates thoughts. Thoughts are what are generated by language. Thoughts in any sense we understand the term. The kinds of thoughts that we use when you reflect or evaluate or make up ideas and so on. They're indistinguishable from language. So if that's correct, and I think it basically is, then language doesn't influence the ability to create novel ideas. It is the instrument for creating novel ideas. And now I should say this historical comment. This position was held right into the early 20th century for over 2 millennia. Early 20th century, it changed basically with behaviorism, and structuralism, which abandoned these ideas, and they were completely forgotten. But they've been revived, and I think modern work is tending to show that they were on the right track. So maybe the question can't be formulated because language and thought just can't be distinguished.
All right, thank you, Dao-Tzu. Fleur's question is next.
Sorry, but I have to go off to the next one. I'm already late for it.
Oh, okay, Noam. Thank you so much. Sorry about that, Fleur. We at least got a snapshot of you. Thank you, Noam. I really appreciate it.
Fun to be with you.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And sorry, Fleur.
Well, I'll bring you guys in quickly. We're still live on YouTube with a solid audience here of 182 people listening live. So, Fleur, what question were you going to ask so everyone can hear it?
Well, we know that Chomsky's theories on language are logocentric. So we know his theories on language constitute that language is descriptive of reality in some way. The thing is I was wondering if we could flip this on its head and say that our reality is descriptive of language in some way. And if what Noam's view on that would be.
Interesting. Well, Don, what do you think? How do you think Noam would wrestle with that question? Because I think you probably.
I think he would say something like, "I don't think we can know that language is a tool." I think, from everything I've heard in this discussion, it seems that he is very much influenced by like American pragmatic thinking and philosophy, where it doesn't really matter the nature of reality. What matters is the way in which we conceive and construct us trying to understand it. And he kind of just moves on from that platform.
I loved how like smackdown pragmatic he was when I asked him about his epistemological standard of truth. It's like, it should be fucking obvious. It's basically what he said. I know Dawkins would have loved that answer. Symmetry, what were you going to ask?
Yeah, man. I wasn't, politics and me, you know how that goes. I was going to ask him over the next 50 years, how would he see linguistics and the philosophy of language and semantics and the way that we study it kind of intertwine with neuroscience? And how would he see that vision of, 50 years plus us studying linguistics? What would it be? What would that look like?
Interesting. Maybe some new frontiers.
Some new ideas that maybe he'd been thinking about or heard from other people that were, in his orbit, so to speak. But, I'm sure he could have extrapolated on that for hours and hours and hours. But I was just going to ask a quick question of what does he think linguistics is going to look like in 50 years? What's going to be the main questions? What are the new questions to ask?
Right. Yeah. Very good questions. Guys, we're going to take a quick break here. In about 15-20 minutes, we're all going to meet on the new call-in app. So, guys, please download the new call-in app. I gave you guys, it's in the pinned comment here on YouTube. We are live every single day on call-in with a new philosophical topic, wrestling with the ideas that mean the most to humanity. So join us on Call In for this group discussion. You're all invited. All you need is a phone to participate, and you're able to call in and speak with us. We're going to focus on the topics that we wrestled with here on today's podcast. Make sure you guys drop a like, share this conversation if you liked it, and consider subscribing. And if you want to get more kind of tied into the Pangburn community and what we do at Pangburn, join us on Discord. We have an online digital tavern where we meet almost every evening, even if just for a few minutes, some of us, just to talk about the topic of the day, whatever, bring your own topic. But it's a lot of fun. I'm going to drop the Discord link for you guys. I feel so thrilled that I had a chance to speak with Mr. Chomsky today. It's just such a I'm overwhelmed with the honor. And Noam Chomsky and I do not agree on everything, that's for sure. We didn't really get into the disagreements today. I think when you have a chance to speak with someone who has garnered so much wisdom over such a long period of time, wrote over 100 books, you want to ask some questions and give them as much time to lay out their wisdom for you. And Noam's he's 93. I think my last conversation with James Randi, he was 90. I think he was 90 or 91. Before James Randi passed. And, and I thought that was a badass answer from Noam regarding death. It was a question I asked James Randi as well, who I do miss very much. He was a great man. And and I thank you guys very much for joining us today for this episode. So come and join us on Call In, and here's the Discord link for any of you who are not members of our Discord server. But we have a lot of fun, and we focus on good faith, helpful discourse here at Pangburn. So until next time, I'm thinking the next podcast is going to be Slavoj Žižek. So I hope you guys are pumped up for that one. That will be a little more electric. But thank you so much to Mr. Noam Chomsky and all of all the contributions he has made to humanity. And yes, we will be live on Call In about 15-20 minutes. So if you just get on Call In, download your download the new app on your phone. It's a new social podcasting app, and we're finding that it's just brilliant for the kind of open discussions that we have. So do join us. Come and be a member of our Discord, and we would love to have you. Thank you, everyone. And as always, let art and science inspire.